This story is not about knights and kings. It is a story of how simple peasants in an extreme situation used every corner of the castle, every bit of warmth and every means at their disposal to survive until dawn. Why were kitchens more important than the throne room? How did horse dung and dirty straw save children from hypothermia? And how could praying in a cold chapel warm you better than any fire? Today we'll reveal 10 of the most unexpected and ingenious ways that helped medieval peasants cheat death from the cold within the walls of a stone fortress. Are you ready to learn that survival in the past was not just suffering, but a triumph of collective intelligence over the elements? Then let's begin. The first thing that comes to mind is a picture of a lord graciously letting his peasants into the great hall, the center of life in the castle, where a huge fireplace is burning. Everyone basks together by the fire, singing songs and waiting for the dawn. This picture, alas, has nothing to do with reality. For the peasant masses, the great hall was not an escape, but one of the coldest and most dangerous places in the castle. A real ice trap disguised by ostentatious grandeur. First, its size and the physics of cold. The great hall was enormous, with high, dark ceilings and massive stone walls, designed to impress, not to warm. It was physically impossible to heat such an enormous space with a single fireplace, even a very large one. The stone from which the walls were built has a huge heat capacity. This means that it works like a giant sponge for heat, literally sucking it out of the air and out of people's bodies. Touch the wall of such a castle in freezing weather, and you will feel the stone instantly pulling the heat out of your palm. The heat from the fireplace, spread by radiation, was felt only a couple of meters from the fire, creating a small, fiercely contested island of comfort. And in the far corners of the hall, at the high lancet windows, covered with oiled cloth or thin plates of horn, icy drafts roam through countless gaps. Trying to warm hundreds of people in such a room is like trying to warm a winter street. Second, rigid social status. The Great Hall was the heart of a lord's household, his public face, and the stage of his power. Even during a siege, his family, his personal knights, squires, and most important servants stayed here. It was a space of power and strict order, not a charitable haven. No one would allow a crowd of dirty, panicked, foul-smelling peasants to turn it into a chaotic, unruly tabor. The place by the fire was a precious resource reserved for their own, those who bore arms and made up the Lord's personal guard. The peasants, had they been allowed in, would have been driven to the cold outer walls, where they would have frozen even faster against the icy stone than in the courtyard. It would have been not only a physical, but also a deeply humiliating experience, further emphasizing their lowly position, even in the face of a common threat. Thirdly, the very functionality of the heating. In early castles, the hearth was often located in the center of the hall. It gave not only heat, but also a huge amount of acrid, suffocating smoke, which had to escape through a special hole in the roof, the lucarna. This upward flow of smoke, like a chimney, created a powerful draft, which carried away much of the precious warm air. As a result, carbon monoxide accumulated beneath the ceiling, and drafts swept in from downstairs. If the fireplace was against a wall, its efficiency was not much higher due to the imperfect design of chimneys of the time. Instead of being a shelter, the Great Hall would have been a giant, wind-blown stone bag where one could choose between hypothermia and suffocation. The peasants, with their practical, age-old savvy, instinctively understood this. They did not seek where glitz and status were. Their collective mind, honed by generations of survival, sought a place where real, utilitarian, physical warmth, albeit devoid of any nobility, was generated. Their way lay not in the ceremonial center of the castle, but on its technical floors. First of all, in the hottest, noisiest, and most vital place of the fortress. And it was not the Lord's bedroom at all. Forget the throne room and the tapestries. On the icy night of the siege, the castle kitchens and their adjoining bakeries became the true center of life, hope, and, more importantly, warmth. It was not just a corner for cooking, but a whole industrial complex, working in an emergency, round-the-clock mode. After all, it was necessary to feed not only the family of the Lord and his retinue, but also the entire sprawling garrison. Hundreds of soldiers who needed hot, caloric food to maintain strength and morale. Imagine this place as a scene from Bruegel's paintings, brought to life and pushed to the limit. There are several huge, human-sized hearths in which logs roar with a roar. Above the fire hang giant copper and iron cauldrons in which gurgling and boiling brews. Thick stews of peas and corned beef, porridge, release dense, moist clouds of hot steam into the room. Whole carcasses of pigs or sheep are roasting on spits slowly turned by the cooks, sizzling and oozing with fat, exuding unbearable heat. And next door, behind the wall, is the bakery, where hundreds of loaves of heavy soldier's bread are baked in several red-hot ovens. The temperature in these rooms was so high that the cooks and their assistants worked half undressed, wearing only canvas pants, even in the bitter cold. The air was thick, heavy, humid, and soaked with a complex bouquet of odors. Roasted meat, fresh bread, onions, garlic, sour ale, human sweat, and acrid wood smoke. It was here that crowds of freezing peasants instinctively flocked, like moths to a candle flame. Of course, they were not allowed into the workspace itself, where they would get tangled under the feet of the ever-hurried and angry cooks. But they crowded into the adjoining corridors, storerooms, washing rooms, and passageways. They sat on the floor, huddled against the warm, humming stone walls behind which the fire roared. Even the outer wall of the kitchen or bakery, facing the courtyard, was palpably hot to the touch. Just sitting with one's back against it was a relief, especially for children and the elderly, whose bodies could no longer fight the cold effectively. The Lord and his steward did not drive them away. They realized that it was a matter of survival for their people, their property, in fact. Moreover, they saw it as a practical benefit. Peasant women, more accustomed to domestic work, could help in the kitchen. They sat in warm corners, peeled mountains of root vegetables, washed dishes in large vats, carried water, being in close proximity to the source of heat and receiving an extra bowl of hot chowder for their work. Children were seated in the warmest nooks, away from the open fire but close to the cooling stoves. In addition to the direct heat from the fire, the kitchens generated another valuable resource: hot water and coals. When cooks raked out the cooled but still smoldering coals from the stoves and hearths, they were not thrown away. The peasants could take them away in broken clay pots and use them to heat their temporary shelters in other, colder parts of the castle. Hot water from the cauldrons in which meat or vegetables were boiled, a fat, rich broth, was also valuable. It could not only warm stiffened hands, but poured into a leather burdock and wrapped in rags, could be used as a primitive heating pad that would keep a child warm for several hours. Thus, the kitchen became an informal center of survival. It was noisy, chaotic, crowded, perhaps not the cleanest place, but it was lively and, most importantly, warm. The kitchens and bakeries, however, were woefully short of space and could not accommodate everyone. So the others sought warmth elsewhere, smelling much less pleasant, but, strangely enough, no less salvific. If the kitchens were the technological heart of the castle, the stables, cowsheds, and barns were its biological warmth center. During a raid or siege, not only people, but also all the valuable livestock from the surrounding villages were driven into the safe space inside the castle walls. The lord's war horses, heavy draft oxen, dairy cows, sheep, and pigs. Animals were a strategic resource, both food in case of a long siege and draft power, to rebuild the economy afterwards. They were housed in spacious stables and barns, often adjoining the walls. And these seemingly serviceable rooms were overnight transformed into the most desirable shelters, into real living ovens. A large herbivorous animal such as a horse or cow is a true biological reactor. Their body temperature is higher than that of humans, about 38-39 degrees, and the complex digestive process in their multi-chambered stomachs generates a constant and powerful flow of endogenous heat. When dozens of such reactors gather in one large, enclosed, and poorly ventilated space, the air temperature can be 10, 15, and sometimes 20 degrees higher than outside. The air here was heavy, damp, soaked with the pungent odor of ammonia from urine, the sweet smell of stale hay, and the thick, earthy smell of manure. But it was invariably warm. It was in these rooms that most of the peasants found shelter. They were located wherever they could, In the passages between the stalls, in the wide haylofts over the heads of the animals, where the warm air accumulated under the roof itself. They burrowed into the dry hay, which itself was an excellent insulator, creating cozy dens for themselves. But the main source of heat was the floor. It was covered with a thick, several dozen centimeters thick layer of straw bedding mixed with manure. This layer, known as deep bedding, was a true miracle of medieval biotechnology. In its depths, aerobic composting processes began. Bacteria decomposed organic matter, generating a huge amount of heat. The temperature inside this layer could reach 40–50 degrees. In fact, it was a primitive, warm floor system. The peasants slept on this floor, protected from moisture by a layer of clean hay, and they were constantly warmed from below by this natural heat. Families with small children instinctively tried to get close to the quietest animals. The infant, wrapped in rags, could be put to sleep next to the warm, soft side of a sleeping cow, or in a cubbyhole where sheep lay huddled together. The animals, accustomed to the constant presence of people, paid no attention to them. Their steady, warm breath, the steam from their bodies, and the heat from them literally saved the children from hypothermia. It was a symbiosis dictated by desperation. The humans received life-saving warmth, while the animals received extra care and protection from predators or enemies that might sneak into the castle. In addition, cattle were a source of fresh food. Cows continued to give milk, which went primarily to children, pregnant, and lactating women. This was an invaluable help when all other food was strictly rationed. To a modern person, the thought of sleeping in the same room with cows and horses, breathing in the acrid smell of manure, may seem disgusting, but for the medieval peasant, for whom livestock was an integral part of daily life, often even his own hut was used to keep young animals in the winter. It was perfectly natural. He was not choosing between comfort and discomfort, but between life and death. And in that choice, a warm, ammonia-smelling barn was far preferable to the icy stone floor of a corridor blown through. But even in those cold corridors, they found ways to keep warm using the most throwaway and unexpected materials. Not everyone was blessed with a blessed place in the kitchens or warm stables. Most of them had to stay in the coldest, unheated, and uncomfortable rooms of the castle, in the huge humming cellars and sub-cellars, on the lower floors of the watchtowers, in the covered galleries along the walls, or simply in the courtyard, under hastily made awnings. It was freezing cold here, and the stone floors sucked the last vestiges of heat from the bodies. Then the collective ingenuity and the use of the most accessible, cheap, and, at first glance, useless insulation material, straw and reeds, came into play. The floors in castles, even in the Lord's chambers, were often covered with a layer of fresh reed mats or just a thick layer of scattered straw. This was done for relative warmth, softness when walking, and, importantly, to absorb dirt, food residue, and other debris. Periodically, the top, dirtiest layer was removed and a fresh layer was laid. But old, often stale and dirty straw was not thrown away. It was carefully collected and stored in dry barns for various household needs. First of all, for bedding livestock, or as an additive to clay for construction. In times of emergency, this garbage became an invaluable rescue resource. By order of the manager, or rather on their own initiative, the peasants would bring from the storehouses huge piles of this old, compacted straw and reeds. In a corner of the large cold room, as sheltered from the draft as possible, they began to build a gigantic common nest together. It wasn't just a disorderly pile, they acted like experienced engineers. First, they laid out a dense, high rampart of the most battered and damp straw around the perimeter of the future nest, creating a barrier against drafts. Then they filled the inner space with drier and looser straw, piling it thickly, up to half a meter high or more, creating a soft, supple, and warm feather bed. Then they literally burrowed into this gigantic pile like mice into a haystack. The principle of action is the same as in modern sleeping bags with down or synthetic insulation. Dry, hollow straw stalks contain a huge amount of still air, which is one of the best natural heat insulators. The thick layer of straw completely cut off the icy cold coming from the stone floor. So that a man was in a kind of cocoon where his own body heat was not dissipated in the cold space, but captured and stored in the countless air pockets between the straws. Several families, up to 20 or 30 people, could sleep in such communal nests. They lay tightly together, head to foot, enhancing the overall effect and minimizing heat loss. In the very center, in the warmest and safest place, children, infants, and infirm old people were placed. On top, they could additionally cover themselves with their coarse woolen cloaks, burlap removed from the wagons, or empty grain sacks, creating another layer of insulation. Yes, the old straw must have been crawling with fleas and dust mites, and it smelled of prawns and mice, but it was warm. It was the difference between a night spent in the agony of cold shivering on bare rock and a night spent in relative warmth and restful sleep. This simple but ingenious technique demonstrates how peasants knew how to turn waste into a resource. For them, there was no such thing as trash. Everything that could be used for survival was used, and the main, most invaluable resource was themselves. The most accessible, inexhaustible, and efficient source of heat was people themselves. Medieval peasants may not have known the laws of thermodynamics, but they understood on an intuitive level, developed over centuries, the main principle of survival in the cold, which today scientists admirably observe in emperor penguins in the icy desert of Antarctica. To survive, one must forget about personal space and huddle together. Once in the cold, humming room, people did not scatter into corners in family groups. They instinctively, almost immediately, formed one or more dense, compact masses. They sat on the straw or directly on the floor, shoulder to shoulder, back to back, knees to knees, pressing against each other as much as possible to leave no gap for cold air. This simple action had a tremendous thermodynamic effect. A single person in the cold rapidly loses heat from the entire surface area of their body. Heat loss is directly proportional to the exposed surface area. But when 100 people huddle together in a dense mass, the total surface area in contact with the cold air decreases dramatically in relation to their total mass. Those who found themselves inside the group were surrounded on all sides, like a living blanket, by the warmth of their neighbors' bodies. Their own heat did not go nowhere, but warmed their neighbor, who, in turn, warmed them. The temperature in the center of such a human colony could be tens of degrees higher than at the edges. This strategy was not chaotic, but highly organized, subject to the unwritten laws of survival. In the very center of the dense crowd, in the core of warmth, were placed those who were most vulnerable to the cold. Infants in their mother's arms, small children, pregnant women, and frail old people. Around them, as a second layer of protection, were older women and teenagers, and the outer, coldest and windiest circle was formed by adult, healthy men. They stood or sat with their backs turned to the cold, and with their bodies like a living wall, took the brunt of the icy drafts, protecting those inside. Moreover, this system was dynamic. Like the penguins in their famous turtle, the people in the outer circle did not stay there forever. That would have been a death sentence. By unspoken agreement, there was a constant, slow rotation. Those who were freezing to death at the edge gradually shifted to warmer, inner layers, and those who had warmed up in the center took their place at the periphery, giving others a chance to survive. It was an amazing act of collective self-regulation and justice, dictated by necessity. The psychological effect was equally important. Physical contact, the feeling of a neighbor's firm shoulder, shared rhythmic breathing, all this created a powerful sense of unity, safety, and security. It was not so scary in such a crowd. People shared not only warmth, but also strength of spirit. They could talk quietly, passing on rumors, recite a common prayer. Women could sing lullabies to their children to soothe them. It was the ultimate act of collective survival, where personal comfort and even personal identity were sacrificed for the common good. In this human mass, individual families and individuals disappeared. Everyone became one big, warm, breathing, and hopeful organism that resisted the cold as a unit. And to maintain the physical strength of this unique organism, sometimes extraordinary and not the most obvious measures were required. Under conditions of siege and cold, calories were worth their weight in gold, becoming the hardest currency in a world where money had lost all meaning. The human body, desperately fighting hypothermia, expended enormous amounts of energy just to maintain its internal temperature, burning fat and glycogen stores at an alarming rate. The food that the peasants might have brought with them when fleeing the village in a panic was quickly running out. And castle supplies, designed for a long siege, were strictly rationed and primarily intended for the garrison, the soldiers on whom the defense of the walls depended. But the castle had one strategic resource that a wise ruler could use in an emergency to save his people: ale. The lord and his steward were not sentimental philanthropists, but pragmatists. They had a vested interest in ensuring that as many of their peasants as possible survived. After all, after the end of the siege, when the enemy retreats, it was these people who had to rebuild the burned village, recultivate the fields, and in the future, pay taxes to fill the Lord's coffers. A dead peasant is a lost asset, a sunk investment. Therefore, at a critical moment, seeing people beginning to weaken from cold and hunger, the manager of the castle could give orders to unseal several barrels of ale from the Lord's cellars and give the refugees an emergency portion. It wasn't about getting desperate people drunk, of course. The strong, aged ale that the Lord himself and his knights drank was too valuable. It was probably the so-called small beer, or table ale, a low-alcohol but very nutritious drink that was a daily meal, not a means of entertainment. This thick, cloudy, opaque drink, with a consistency resembling liquid porridge, was the real liquid bread of the Middle Ages. It was brewed from barley malt, was rich in carbohydrates, and contained valuable B vitamins from the yeast sediment. For a frozen, exhausted, and hungry man, a mug of warm, it could be heated on coals in the kitchens. Ale was a real elixir of life. The effect was complex and immediate. First, it was fast carbohydrates and easily digestible calories. The sugars from the malt were instantly absorbed into the bloodstream, giving the body a needed burst of energy that it could immediately convert into heat. Second, even a small amount of alcohol, usually 1 to 2%, caused the peripheral blood vessels to dilate. Blood rushed to the skin, creating a powerful, albeit deceptive, subjective sensation of warmth and blush. In a state of extreme hypothermia, this sensation was critical, for it fought apathy and restored the will to live. Thirdly, it was a safe, sanitized liquid, sanitized by the brewing and fermentation process, which quenched thirst far better than the dubious, icy water from the castle well, where contagion might lurk. Handing out ale was also a powerful psychological move. It was a visible, tangible sign of care on the part of the Lord. In a world of strict and inviolable social hierarchy, such a gesture showed the peasants that they were not just abandoned at the mercy of fate, but as people whose lives were of value to him. It raised morale, gave hope and strength to endure hardship further. Imagine this scene in a cold, semi-dark cellar where hundreds of people are huddled together in a shivering, silent heap. The steward appears, accompanied by guards, and servants roll out a steaming barrel of warm ale. An order is given. People come to life, lining up, holding out their wooden bowls and mugs. Everyone gets their measured portion. They drink slowly, savoring every drop, feeling the invigorating warmth spread through their bodies. The numbness go away, the energy to last a few more hours. It wasn't just a drink, it was a communion of life, a collective ritual that united and warmed not only bodies but also desperate souls. But there were other, less obvious sources of warmth in the castle, connected not with food and drink, but with the harsh craft of war. In addition to kitchens, any self-respecting castle had other hotspots, craft workshops that worked with redoubled, furious energy during a siege. Chief among them was undoubtedly the forge. The forge, which constantly maintained a roaring, blindingly white heat for forging and mending weapons, was one of the hottest places in the fortress, a veritable mini-volcano at the heart of the castle. For fire safety reasons, the forge was usually located in a separate, well-ventilated structure in the courtyard, often with stone walls and an earthen floor. But even its exterior walls and tile roof radiated a strong heat that could be felt at a distance. The peasants who had no room at the kitchens could find their salvation here. They clung to the walls of the forge like ants, huddled against them, trapping the precious heat from the stones. The acrid smoke, the flying sparks, and the deafening rhythmic clatter of the hammers were a small price to pay for staying warm. Work in the forge did not stop day or night during the siege. The garrison constantly needed repairs. Swords broken in skirmishes had to be repaired, bent spear and arrowheads had to be straightened, holes in helmets and shields had to be repaired, and new horseshoes for war horses had to be forged. The blacksmith and his apprentices, black with soot and drenched in sweat, kept up this infernal fire that gave life not only to the deadly weapons, but also to the freezing people in the neighborhood. Nearby there could have been a weapons workshop, where they worked with finer tools, repairing armor, bows and crossbows. There may also have been small portable burners for heating metal plates and rivets. There was also the constant use of boiling wax and resin to treat the bowstring and shaft, which were heated over an open fire. All of this created small but numerous and highly desirable sources of localized heat. People took advantage of every opportunity. They could stand for hours at the ajar doors of these workshops, catching a stream of hot air. With permission or secretly, they could bring hot coals, pieces of rejected, red-hot metal to use as improvised warmers in their cold shelters. It was a pragmatic use of the industrial heat of the castle for survival purposes. Such neighborliness with artisans was also practical. Healthy male peasants, who could not bear to sit idle, could help in the work, performing the simplest and heaviest tasks. Pumping huge leather furs for hours, fanning the fire in the crucible, bringing coal and water, carrying heavy work pieces. This grueling work not only kept them warm, it warmed them from the inside out, from the physical effort. In addition, it gave them a sense of belonging to the common defense, of being useful. It was better than sitting in idleness, fear, and cold. Thus, the production areas of the castle became another important center of attraction for the refugees, who instinctively sought not comfort, but energy in any form. In the vast humming and deserted rooms of the castle, the main enemy was not so much the cold itself, but its faithful ally, the draft. The icy, penetrating wind that blew through the stone corridors, staircases, and halls, through the loopholes and window openings, instantly blew out any stored heat and chilled the bones, turning shivering into agony. To survive, the first thing to do was to stop this invisible movement of air, and for this purpose, everything that could be found in the numerous castle vaults was used. On the order of the castellan, castle manager, or simply on the soldier's initiative, any large pieces of dense cloth were extracted from the dusty storerooms. Their value in peacetime did not matter in the face of a mortal threat. It could be old, worn and soaked sails from riverboats, rough tarpaulins to cover wagons, thick, horse sweat-smelling woolen blankets for horses, rough sacking from empty sacks, old moth-eaten carpets. In the most critical situation, even expensive hand-woven tapestries could be removed from the cold stone walls in the less important chambers. A picture of a heroic battle or a pastoral hunt on a tapestry was far less valuable than the lives of a dozen peasant children who could be wrapped in this thick woolen cloth. From these various materials, the peasants, working together, built primitive but effective internal shelters. In a large cellar, in a corner of a courtyard, or in a spacious hall, they built tents and teepees of sorts, stretching fabric between stone pillars, walls, or simply hastily constructed wooden frames. Such improvised walls did not so much warm as create an enclosed, windless space. Inside such a shelter, the air was still. The heat from the breath and bodies of dozens of people was not immediately carried away by the draft, but slowly accumulated, creating its own separate microclimate. The temperature inside such a fabric barricade could be several vital degrees higher than outside. It was the difference between a tolerable existence and sure hypothermia. It was another form of collective engineering. People worked together, pulling heavy, frozen, unyielding fabrics, securing them with scraps of rope, their belts, or simply by pressing heavy stones to the floor. They created a common, protected space where they could shelter from the merciless wind. Inside these makeshift tents, in the semi-darkness, they placed their straw nests we mentioned earlier, further increasing insulation and creating a multi-layered system of protection from the cold. This process transformed the vast, chaotic, and hostile space of the castle into an ordered cellular system of shelters. Instead of one large, cold volume, There were many smaller, warmer, and psychologically comfortable cells. It was a simple but extremely effective survival strategy based on the main principle of fighting the cold. First stop the wind and then keep warm. But what to do if one's own heat, even in shelter, is already catastrophically insufficient? Even in the warmest and windless shelter, in a dense human mass, the body eventually cools down. Especially vulnerable were those who could not generate their own heat effectively: small children, infirm old people, and the sick. Their bodies were rapidly losing energy, and they were falling into the dangerous state of apathy that precedes fatal hypothermia. To save them, an external, concentrated, and, most importantly, portable source of heating was required. And the solution was ingenious in its primitive simplicity: hot stones. There were several places in the castle where a strong, fierce fire burned constantly: kitchens, bakeries, and the forge. The peasants, with or without the manager's permission, used these industrial fires to charge their primitive but effective warmers. They did not take the first stones they could find. The experience of generations told them that they needed smooth, dense, rounded river boulders or pebbles. Such stones accumulate heat well and do not crack from sudden heat, unlike porous or laminated rocks. If there were no stones, old broken bricks from dismantled masonry were used. They put these stones and bricks directly into the hot coals or on the edge of the hearth where the temperature was highest. After a while, the stones were red hot. Then, using two long sticks as tongs, they carefully removed them from the fire. Touching such a stone would mean a terrible burn. A naked hot stone could instantly burn through the cloth and set fire to the straw. Therefore, it was carefully and layer by layer wrapped in any available rags: pieces of old worn-out clothes, sacking, scraps of leather. It was important that the cloth was slightly damp. This created a vapor layer and prevented it from catching fire. The result was a simple but very effective individual heating pad. Such a stone wrapped in rags could retain and slowly release heat for several hours. These portable hearths were invaluable. They were distributed to the coldest shelters and given first to those who needed them most. A hot, wrapped stone was placed in the very center of the straw nest, and the children would sleep around it like kittens around their mother. It could be placed at the feet of an old man suffering from poor circulation and perpetually icy feet. The woman could press it against her belly to warm herself, and the baby cuddled against her. The soft, deep warmth from the stone slowly spread around her, creating an island of comfort and saving her from the numbness of the icy night. It was a continuous, well-organized process. One group of people, mostly teenagers, carried the cooled stones back to the fire, while another group brought new, hot ones. It was a sort of heat relay, a vital logistical operation that allowed heat from several powerful stationary sources to be efficiently distributed throughout the castle, delivering it to those most in need. This method required no sophisticated technology other than fire, stones, and rags. But it did require organization, coordination, and mutual assistance. It proves once again that the peasants' survival in the castle was not a passive waiting for their fate, but an active, meaningful, collective process, where the smallest opportunity to fight the cold was used. And sometimes this struggle was not only on the physical level, but also on the deepest spiritual level. In the hierarchy of warmth and security of the castle, the chapel occupied a very special, paradoxical place. From a purely physical point of view, it was not a warm place. It was a stone, humming room, often with high ceilings to inspire awe, and with thin, albeit glazed, windows that let in the cold. But it had several key advantages over the other cold halls. First, it was relatively small compared to the Great Hall and well insulated from outside drafts, as it had been built with great care. Secondly, during the service, which could go on almost continuously during the siege, dozens or even hundreds of expensive wax candles were lit there. Each candle was a small but living source of heat, and together they could slightly but noticeably raise the temperature and, no less importantly, dry out the cold, dank air. But the main warmth of the chapel was not physical, but spiritual. In moments of mortal danger, when enemies howled outside the walls in cold, fear and despair reigned inside. People instinctively sought solace in faith as their last hope. The chapel became the center of psychological and therefore physical survival. The castle priest, realizing his role, did not drive the refugees away. On the contrary, he gathered them for common prayer, turning the house of God into a refuge for bodies and souls. Imagine this scene full of grim grandeur. Outside the castle walls are the screams of enemies and the rumble of siege machines. Inside, cold, darkness, and uncertainty. And in the midst of this chaos, people crammed into the cramped space of the chapel gather in silence, lit only by hundreds of flickering candles. Their flames are reflected in the gilding of the altar and in eyes full of fear and hope. The calm, measured voice of the priest reading the eternal words of prayer in Latin sounds like an anchor in a raging sea. The general, at first timid, then increasingly powerful singing of the Psalms, unites hundreds of frightened voices into one mighty, vibrating chorus. This common prayer had a tremendous therapeutic effect. It gave people hope. It reminded them that they are not alone, that they are part of something bigger, that God is with them, who is stronger than any enemy. The shared ritual of standing, kneeling, and making the sign of the cross together structured the chaos, bringing order and meaning to their frightened minds. By focusing on prayer, people were distracted from the excruciating cold and paralyzing fear. Moreover, faith gave them the strength to endure. In the Christian paradigm, suffering was perceived not as senseless agony, but as a test sent from above, which must be endured with dignity and humility to earn eternal salvation. This changed the very attitude to what was happening, turning passive, trembling victims into active participants in the spiritual struggle. In the chapel, too, people huddled together in tight groups, warming each other. But here they were united not only by physical warmth, but also by a common faith, a common hope. This created a sense of community and resilience that was as important to survival as fire or food. The chapel was the last line of defense, not of the stone walls of the castle, but of the human spirit. And as long as the spirit was not broken, the body could withstand the most unthinkable trials. A night in a medieval castle for peasants was not just a test of cold, but a test of collective survival, and they passed it brilliantly. Forget the romantic image. Their salvation was not the noble lord or the hot fireplace in the great hall, but the steam from the kitchen boilers, the stinking heat of the stables, the rotten straw turned into nests, and the heat from the forge's crucible. They survived because of their incredible ingenuity and their ability to see the resource in what we consider trash. They used every source of heat, every opportunity, every rag and every rock. But their main weapon was cohesion. They acted as a single organism, warming each other with their bodies, sharing the last of their lives and supporting the fallen in spirit. The story of their survival is not a hymn to suffering. It is a hymn to human ingenuity, mutual aid, and the indomitable will to live. It teaches us that in the most desperate situations, the most valuable resource is not things, but the people around you. If you are interested in this journey into the harsh but brilliant reality of the Middle Ages, give us a like and subscribe to our channel. There are many more amazing stories to come about how our ancestors cheated death and changed the world with only their own minds and wills.